post-pandemic times, we're falling back into the ways in which we have always done things. And I would hope that Giles' invitation to think about schools as places for passion and purpose for learning are actually going to be driving our work. And he showed actually examples of that possibility, right? It is possible. So today we're shifting gears and we're going to think about deep learning within the family. And I think Meredith Row actually needs no introduction in this network. Her work inspires so many of us, so many of you know her and know her work. And she is, I have to read the long title that she has, she's the Sol Sands Professor of Early Learning and Development, and she also directs as a faculty co-chair the program of Human Development and Education. And of course, she's a dear friend, and it's great to have you here, Meredith, having time to share your work with us. Her research focuses on understanding the role of parent and family factors in children's early language and literacy development, as you all know, and she's actually one of the most influential researchers in the field. Actually, Meredith's talk was scheduled to be in person in 2020, and then it became, the first virtual talk that we had. So this in-person talk is probably the most awaited in-person talk in the history of our network, Meredith. So thank you so much for being here with us, and I'll let you to start. I'm going to move so I can see your slides.
All right.
Welcome.
Great.
So let's welcome Meredith.
Thank you so much, Paola. It's great to be here and to join this group and to see so many familiar faces. And I apologize if you were at my talk several years ago when it was virtual and my Wi-Fi wasn't
working. And we have all kinds of glitches at our end.
Anyway,
also,
it was did not go as smoothly as we hoped. I thought what I would do is, when I was thinking about this, is I know some of you probably know my work a little bit, some might not know it at all, is I'm taking a step back and I'm sort of presenting like my overarching program of research with some evidence along the way. And then I'm going to stop and sort of say a little bit about what I've been doing for the past couple of years, really just on the last couple of slides, and thinking about like the challenges we've been encountering and where things are going. So that's sort of the layout. I've planned, I think if I were to go through this without stopping, it would take about an hour. So there's plenty of time to interrupt me and have discussion along the way. And please don't hesitate to do that. That should be just fine. Any other? No? Okay, we're ready. So. And hopefully you can all see. All right, great. I have one video that I'll show, and I think it should work. I tested it out. So, when I think about the role of family in early literacy development, this is sort of how I situate my work more broadly. I come at this from the perspective of the educational problem of income achievement gaps. Which led me to be thinking more and more about the early environment. So just to put this out there, this isn't data from the US, but we see very similar data in other countries that have large income inequality, where this chart here is showing you 5 different quintiles in socioeconomic status of children's reading scores from kindergarten to grade 2. And this is with national publicly available data in the United States. But basically what you see there is that when children get to kindergarten, those disparities are already there. And they don't close much over the first several years of schooling. Of course, there are amazing intervention programs in school that are designed to tackle this problem once children are in school. But what it suggests to me is that this income achievement gap in reading is actually growing most during the first 5 years of life, right? And then it remains relatively large. So when I see these data, I think, well, we have to do something earlier, right? So that we can, stop those trajectories from widening before they're already substantiated. So we need to look to that sort of early environment. And then I'm shifting here to say language development instead of literacy, and so why is that? Well, it's because if you think about, well, what are we measuring in kindergarten when we're measuring children's reading, right? Most children, at least in the United States, are 5 years old. They go to kindergarten. Most of them are not reading in the sense of like decoding print and reading sentences off the page. So what those tests end up being mostly is our children's oral language skills and their decoding ability. So we look at things like vocabulary primarily, also their ability to know the names of the letters and the sounds they make. But at this particular age, it turns out that it's those oral language skills, particularly vocabulary, that are the strongest predictors of later reading in school. Okay, so my goal has been, well, how do we boost these kindergarten vocabulary skills by looking at the early family environment? Again, we end up with this situation where the child's oral language skills in kindergarten, that's sort of, this child right here in the middle is super predictive of their 3rd and 4th grade reading comprehension and school success more broadly, from Paola's work, and reading becomes such an essential skill for learning in all domains. And we can trace this kindergarten vocabulary variation back to to the early language exposure in the early years. Okay, so basically what we know is that children's early language environments in home and preschool are very strongly related to their vocabulary, socioeconomic status, and other factors of families. This is not super surprising because language is a social process, right? Vocabulary, when you think about it, is easy for us, all of us who are already literate, to learn words pick up vocabulary words from reading because we can read, right? But when you're a child in the first 5 years of life, you can't read yet. So you can only really learn those words that you're exposed to, right? So giving the children those language opportunities can lead them to enter school and kindergarten with large oral language skills and set them up to succeed. So it's this social piece that I base my work on. There's a lot of evidence that language is a social process, that children need those social interactions. Some sort of negative evidence has come out of the pandemic, speaking to Paola's point, in the sense that the pandemic really did hurt language development, in particular during early childhood. If you think that babies that were sort of born during the pandemic are now in preschool, I think, if you think it's been a few years. And when there's studies coming out showing that those lockdowns hurt children's speech and language skills. Now, this isn't so surprising because, with the pandemic came things like social isolation, mask wearing, right, which removes all the phonological information for babies, distance learning. It's hard enough for us to learn things over Zoom, but for little children, it's very challenging. So there were fewer opportunities for rich language environments for many children, and that has led to even more concern about early vocabulary development. Okay, so that's sort of the context. So in my work, I would set this up as saying that I take a very, very nuanced approach to understanding this issue of the relation between socioeconomic status, broadly defined as parent education and income, features of parent input or the home language environment, how parents communicate with children, whatnot, in that middle box, and also, that extends to preschool classrooms, and then children's vocabulary skills. In my work, I've approached this in a variety of different ways. So I have some research goals and some practical goals. So one of my first research goals that I've focused a fair amount of time on is to understand this first part of the pathway here. So why is it that on average we see socioeconomic differences in, say, how parents communicate with children? And I want to emphasize that this is on average. I have done many studies with entirely low-income samples, and there's a huge amount of variability. Same thing with higher SES samples. But those average differences persist, and they do lead to average differences in children's starting points at school. And so it's understanding why, I think, is really important, because if we can find some proximal factors that explain why, we might be able to intervene around those factors, right? So, so one area of my work is focused on that. second area of work is focused on the second part of the pathway, which is like, what are the qualities of parent speech or input that relate to child vocabulary? So we're way beyond thinking that the quantity of speech matters. There's been tons and tons of work showing that, you know, over and above the quantity, there's all this other good stuff out there that parents and teachers can do that relates more to children's vocabulary learning than just talking at children, for example. So it's uncovering what those features are and taking a developmental perspective. So what are the, at different ages for the child, what are the features that matter? And then, so this work has been going on for like 15 years or so. And then more recently, in the past, I would say 5 years or so, we've tried to take what we've learned and apply it to really small scale interventions to sort of test out the relationships we're seeing to see if they might be causal. And then now what I've been doing, which I'll say a little bit about at the end, is trying to say, okay, well then how can we take all of this work and sort of scale up and give parents information, and how do they want information, and what might be useful. So that's sort of the overview. I'm going to start here with this question mark. So what proximal factors might contribute to parent input? So I think when we all think about why does socioeconomic status, why might it relate to how parents communicate with children? What are the factors that you think about? Does anyone want to offer? Maybe parents are, you know, they're stressed, they don't have as much time, right?
Beliefs.
What's that?
Beliefs.
Beliefs, yeah. Okay, so beliefs is where I'm going, so you're already there. But there are a lot of, you know, structural things that we can do less about, right? So if parents that have less education, you might have fewer skills themselves to draw upon. This is one argument that people make, language and literacy skills. I would argue you don't need a large amount of language and literacy skills to communicate with a child during early childhood, but that's one sort of pathway that people push. Another approach is that, you know, the more time you spend in school, this is an approach argued by Bob Levine that I believe in deeply, the more we get socialized to communicate in certain ways, you know? You sit, you listen, you ask a question, you answer, you take your turn, you know, and that kind of communicative socialization might lead to how you parent your child, right? Just being in school longer. But then there's stress, there's time, there's all these things that come along with you know, poverty that are serious. So, and it's hard to change those things, right? So what I aim to find are these more proximal factors that might be sort of levers in thinking about intervention. And this is, to your point, exactly about beliefs. So in some of the work we've done on this, we found these sort of potentially malleable mechanisms that do seem to contribute to how parents communicate with their children, regardless of their socioeconomic status. So for example, in one paper, we had a diverse sample of families in the Chicago area. There were about 60 families. And we had a pretty strong relationship in the sample between socioeconomic status, education, income, and a whole composite of how parents were talking to their kids when they were toddlers. So we measured things like how many questions does a parent ask, how many words do they use, what's their vocabulary diversity, and things like that. And it was just a composite of language input, and there was a strong relationship. But then, you know, I went and I interviewed all these parents and asked them a series of questions, qualitative questions, but also got some, you know, questionnaire data about their beliefs about child development, their thoughts about intelligence mindsets. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with Carol Dweck's work on intelligence mindsets. So people tend to believe that intelligence might be more fixed or more malleable. And, you know, most people fall in the middle somewhere, but leaning towards one side. And if you think intelligence is more malleable, right, then you think the environment might have more of a difference, right, might play more of a role, like working really hard. Whereas if you think intelligence is more fixed, as a parent, you might lean to think sort of that, well, what I do isn't going to make a difference because that child's going to be as smart as they're going to be, and that's that. So we found in this 2008 study, but in a couple other studies as well, that if you take these parenting beliefs into consideration, their knowledge of child development, in particular, their understanding of what kids are capable of at different ages, and their beliefs about intelligent mindsets, that seems to wipe away the SES effect. on how parents communicate with their children, okay? So that I think is really important because it suggests that if we can give parents information about child development that they might not know, and if we can help them understand that they play a big role in that development, right? That what they do makes a difference in your child's language development, for example, then that should be helpful in changing or enhancing their communication with their children. Does that make sense? Okay. So I think I just said that. We should provide caregivers with information, help them understand how much of a big difference they can make. So I'm going to come back to this because this is the approach that we've taken in some of our small interventions. The second piece is this features of input piece. So we summarized, and so here the question is, we know it's not the quantity of talk that matters so much. What are the things that really are important, and understanding those features of input in a way that could be relevant to anybody, no matter what language they speak, no matter what their communicative style is, but just sort of what are the key points across development that seem to be helpful. And Catherine and I summarized this work in a paper in 2020. And so what we discovered in reviewing the literature in this area, and it's a topic both of us have done a lot of work in ourselves, is that it's helpful to think about the home language environment or the preschool classroom environment in terms of three different dimensions of the language environment, right? There's the interactional dimension, which is sort of, is the child having an opportunity to engage in back and forth, communication with other people, whatever that might be. There's the linguistic dimension, so like what is actually being said, how complex is the language. And then there's the conceptual dimension, which is what's being talked about, like what is the content that's being discussed. Okay, so we have found that this is a nice way to present the work because people understand these three dimensions, but it's also really helpful to think about all three when you look at preschool environments or home environments. And so I'm just going to map out for you what we found. Again, highlighting the importance of the developmental perspective here, because we wouldn't expect the same exact types of sort of, say, linguistic input to be helpful for a 6-month-old as we would for a 4.5-year-old, right? Okay. So we're starting sort of here from birth and going up through age 5, and if you read the paper, there's a lot more examples in there, but I'll just touch on some. So one thing we find over and over and over again that is actually consistent across this entire period is that the child's opportunity to engage in conversational turns, which is what it's sort of being discussed as in the literature right now, is the key. It's not the quantity of talk the child hears, right? It's the amount of engagement the child gets in communicating. So people have described it as, responsiveness on the part of the adult, right? Contingent talk, fluent and connected communication, conversational terms, right? So that is consistent across this entire period as if you can engage that child in a conversation, there's much more learning that can happen out of that situation than if you're just talking at the child. So the takeaway is talk with, not at, right? And that has profound implications for classrooms where teachers do most of the talking, right? So obviously the goal there is to, find ways where you can encourage more back and forth in the classroom. All right, so for the, here's one example. Rachel Romeo was a former PhD student working with me and John Gabrielli at MIT. And she sort of tested this out. We do some studies with using the Lena device where you can record the amount of speech that children hear over a weekend in their homes. And it also gives you a proxy measure of conversational turns. It's not the best data, but it's not terrible. So you get data on how many words the kids hear from an adult, how many words they speak, and then how many conversational turns they engage in. And so we did this study with 4 to 7-year-olds in the Boston area, entirely lower income sample. And Rachel also brought them into the lab at MIT and gave a huge battery of language assessments for the children. And they also participated in an fMRI task in the scanner. And what she found in the end was that there was this strong relationship between the conversational turns at home over a weekend and children's composite language scores in the lab. That relationship did not exist if you looked at the quantity of talk that they heard, the number of adult words. It was the number of conversational turns per hour. And then she found that it was mediated or explained by the activation that they showed in the scanner. Basically, they heard one approach in fMRI is to play stories for children, right? And then you can play them, you can play backwards messages as well, and you look at the difference in their activation in the brain between the forward speech and the backward speech as a measure of sort of efficiency of language processing. And basically she's finding that in these language areas, Broca's area of the brain, the children who engaged in more conversational turns per hour had basically sort of more efficient processing when listening to language, which was the reason that their composite scores were higher. Okay, so it's just one potential mechanism, it's not causal. But this, she did not see for the amount of words that the parents spoke or the amount of words that the kids spoke. So that's the important thing, I think, more than anything. The effect was really the turns, the back and forth, okay? And there's been a lot of other studies out there now showing that way over and above what kids hear, the engagement of the conversations is essential. So that's just one example there. All right, let's move on to the next dimension, which is linguistically adaptive. So here we see a lot of differences over development, not surprisingly. So we know, for example, that babies actually respond more to that baby talk or motherese, right? So, which we can also call IDS or infant-directed speech. So using that higher pitch and the elongated vowels captures baby's attention, and they actually can process those sounds and make use of that phonology better. We know when you're communicating with a 1-year-old, it's really helpful to repeat words. Often you need to hear words used multiple times to learn them. But then as children grow and you know, their cognitive abilities increase, the input can get more linguistically challenging, and it's helpful if it does, right? So by the time you're interacting with a toddler, we actually, you know, have multiple studies showing that it's more diverse vocabulary that helps rather than repetition. Repetition is helpful with younger children. Diversity is helpful with older children. Asking challenging WH questions, so, you know, in English, the who, what, where, when, why, how kinds of questions gets children talking. It encourages those back and forths, right? So you can see the dimensions kind of leading into one another here. But it also requires the child to give a verbal response, unless you're saying where, to make a point. And the sophistication of vocabulary, if you haven't ever read Catherine's The Wise Men in the Snow paper, it's an excellent paper showing that very clearly that that young children can handle sophisticated vocabulary words, and that it's helpful to use sophisticated vocabulary words around children. Then when we get up to, you know, the preschool ages 4 and 5, syntactic complexity becomes extremely helpful, and so children can handle long, complex utterances with multiple clauses and embedded clauses and all of that. And it's helpful to expose them to that kind of speech. And, you know, unfortunately, you don't get that kind of speech that much in spoken language, but that's where books can be extremely helpful as well, because, you know, there's a lot of data showing that actually for vocabulary and for syntax, books can bring in complexity that you might not experience in your day-to-day interactions. Okay, so that's just an overview, a couple examples. We did one study with a full sample of low-income dads who were participating in early Head Start with their toddlers, and found that fathers who asked more WH questions of their toddlers when they were playing at home had children with larger vocabularies. That was at the same time, so that was a concurrent finding. but also who had greater verbal reasoning skills 1 year later. So even within this entirely low-income sample, dads who were interacting and asking more questions have children with these sort of greater skills later on. And then, one thing that comes up with this work all the time, I don't know if you're thinking this yourself, is that, well, it could just be genetic, right? So, if the parents who don't use more vocabulary, it's just because of genetics that the children are going to have lower language or something, not because of what they're exposed to. There's a fair amount of data now sort of debunking this, but this is actually an older study that I find compelling, because what they did was they looked at the same kind of studies but with preschool teachers, right, who are not related to the children. So they took this is Jan Ellen Huttenlocher's work in Chicago, but she took a whole bunch of preschool classrooms in the Chicago area, tested the kids in the beginning of the year in their syntactic comprehension with a measure that they made up, basically point to the picture where the lamp fell off the table, right, rather than on the table, etc. And gave them the same test at the end of the year and measured how the teachers were communicating during like whole group time with the kids in between. And the teachers who were producing more complex syntax in their utterances during the course of the year had students who improved more on that syntactic comprehension test than the teachers who were using fewer complex syntax. Okay? So I think this is important. It speaks to the role of the environment, beyond genetics. It also speaks to the role of teachers in classrooms and the language they use. And again, getting back to that point about books, right? We can bring in, it's hard to tell teachers to, use more relative clauses when you talk to the kids, right? That's not going to help. But you can do things like, choose books that have complex sentences, or choose to talk about topics that might elicit longer sentences, which is what I'll get to next. Okay, so that's the linguistic dimension, and now we get to the conceptual dimension. So, the way to think about this is sort of, I said earlier, what's being talked about, but I mean that in terms of sort of topics of conversation that kids are able to engage in, right? So if you think about a 1-year-old, for example, the reason I put gesture and here and now there is because we know from tons and tons of studies that 1-year-olds learn words the best if you are talking about what they are looking at. Okay, so this is all Linda Smith's work in Indiana. If their attention is focused on, for example, the things you're labeling, right? And one way to do that is to point at things and label them to make it even easier for them. But basically, the conversations that are most helpful for the 1-year-old are the conversations that are about the here and now, right? About the things that they are in the moment, looking at. Whereas when you get to the 4-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, they can handle these abstract conversations about the there and then, about the future, right? And we've done a lot of work with Viola showing that these early decontextualized conversations are the most powerful at that age, right? Sure, of course, if you're reading a book and there's a picture of something the child's never seen before, you go ahead and label it and they learn that word like with one exposure, basically. But when you're thinking about conversations and what you can talk about, conversations about how things work in the world and how what you're doing today is going to be similar to what you guys did last week, and those types of things are the types of conversations that can be most helpful. And again, to the point about the dimensions overlapping, if you're talking about the past, you sort of, by default, end up using more complex syntax, right? Because you end up saying things like, yesterday during recess, do you remember when we saw blah, 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 right? Because you have to situate what you're saying in a place and a time, or who do you think is going to be the parent helper in school later today? If you're talking with your child during breakfast or something like that. So this is where I'm saying is like when you think about giving advice to parents or teachers, if you tell parents or teachers to talk more about abstract. We typically tell them to talk about the past, talk about the future, and then sort of like the complex syntax comes along with it. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just I'm going to give you two examples, one about gesture and one about decontextualized talk of some of the work that we've been doing. And we'll go through those examples. Are there any questions or anything at this point? I'm going to take a sip of water. No, we're good? All right. Okay, so gesture. Why is gesture important? You may know that children communicate with gestures before they speak. Okay? So it's an amazing way to learn what a child has to say before they can talk. Children's first gestures are primarily what we call deictic gestures, so they include reference to objects, people, locations, doing things like showing somebody something, or pointing. And pointing is really, once children start pointing, it becomes the most common gesture that children use and the most useful. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also have conventional gestures that can differ across cultures, things like nodding and waving, going like this to be picked up, etc. Yeah?
Would you include there not physical gestures, so like a smile or like a sound?
We include nodding and shaking. Smiling is not necessarily considered a communicative gesture, although it can be used to communicate meaning. Yeah. These are the gestures that we see mostly for the first 2 years of life. When children get a little older, they use even more complicated representational gestures. Like they can do things like flap their hands to indicate bird or flying and things like that, but we often don't see those gestures until after about 30 months. I'm going to show you an example of a parent and a 1-year-old, a 10-month-old, I think, 10, 11, 12-ish, forget. I don't know if the sound's going to work, but to be perfectly honest, it doesn't really matter because what we're doing is looking at the gesture. But I'm going to put this microphone here just in case. Okay, so this came from one of our research studies. We're in the family's home. We brought these bags of toys. They took out this book, and it's called Goodnight Gorilla. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It has a lot of pictures and very few words. And I'll just show you a little bit of the interaction, but pay attention to the gestures. Why is this not working?
You need space.
What's that?
Oh, yeah.
Roar, yeah. The gorilla let my lion out of the cage. Good night, hyena. Good night, giraffe. Me? Yeah, they're like a doggy. Like doggies love doggies. Yeah. Good night, armadillo. Me? Yeah, lion. Uh-oh, the animal's been following the guy home.
Okay. I know, he's got such a perfect little finger, right? Well, it's actually interesting because there's data that show that some children start pointing with their whole hand and then they transition to the index finger. And it's their use of the index finger points in particular that's sort of more predictive of language. All right, so we see a lot of this with little kids. We've done some more work recently, which actually I didn't throw in here, but finding that looking in the same way at children's showing and giving gestures even earlier can give you some of the same information that we can get from pointing around 10, 12 months. So it turns out that children start with showing and giving around 5, 6, 7 months, and then they transition to pointing, and then they transition to language. So what do we do with this, and why do we care so much about the gesture? Let me show you. In terms of methods, what we do is we transcribe all these things. Maybe you've heard Catherine talk about this kind of stuff before. And we include a lot of information in there about the gesture. So when the mom said, "What does a lion say?" she pointed to the picture of the lion in the book, which was a deictic finger point to the picture of the lion, which reinforced what she said in speech. That's what that means. And if you have that in your transcript, you can add up a whole bunch of things later on, like how many points, how many finger points, how many points that actually where the mother's message was the same as what she was pointing to, for example. And then you see the child said, "roar," and it goes on and on. All right, so that's how we get the data. When we do this kind of work, we find interesting relationships between children's early gesture and later language. So for example, in that diverse sample in Chicago that I talked about earlier, this is just a correlation plot, but basically we see that the number of gestures children produce at 14 months, or the number of different things they point to, either way you look at it, is predictive of their Peabody picture vocabulary skills scores at age 54 months. And it's a pretty strong relationship. Now this is before the children are talking. So basically, it's an early indicator, right? The kids aren't saying anything yet. Of course they have language comprehension skills, but they're not saying anything yet. But if you look at the amount, and this is during a 90-minute interaction at the home with a caregiver who's there, doing whatever they want is the situation. So we look further in the data, and we see a few interesting things that could be interpreted different ways. But the first thing we found that we were really sort of surprised about, and at first somewhat horrified about, was that we found socioeconomic status, here, let me point with this, right here, parent education and family income, is related to that child gesture measure at 14 months. And we thought, oh wow, people are going to say it's this genetic thing, why are the 14-month-olds from the lower income families gesturing less? And then we looked really closely at the interactions and found that it was because the parents were gesturing more in the higher income families during those 90-minute interactions. So it wasn't like the kids from the lower income families were born to gesture less. They were gesturing less during those interactions because the parents were gesturing less with them. Now this is not a causal analysis, but I have done the intervention work to sort of show that I think this is a causal relationship here where children see other people gesture, you know, even in the beginning of that interaction, the mom was the first one to point, and then the child got his finger out and was going like this, right? So, you know, if they're playing with things, if they're, you know, interacting, kids whose parents gesture more themselves in those interactions. And then, so what we looked at was that robust relationship, that income achievement gap relationship between socioeconomic status and the children's PPBT scores at age 5, and we found that some of that relationship, right here, not all of it, this is another mediation analysis, is explained by children's gesture at age 14 months. So does that make sense? So before kids, so the takeaway message here is before kids are even talking, they're being socialized to communicate more or less with gesture. The extent to which they're communicating with gesture is predictive of their vocabulary at age 5, right? And so we found this in a couple samples now in the United States. Some of my more recent work, because of my wonderful PhD students, has been looking at a lot of these things in other cultures. This is So-Yeon Shin. She was a former PhD student. Paola was also on her dissertation committee. And she did a very similar study in South Korea, where she had 31 infants, also 14 months, and then looked at their language at age 3. And basically this is just the regression table from her paper, which is now in press, in the journal Infancy, but basically she finds the exact same thing. And I'm just highlighting here that, you know, controlling for a whole bunch of other measures that might be relevant in this sample. It's the children's gesture types, which is a number of different things they're pointing to basically during an interaction at 14 months with their parent that predicts their 36-month perceptive and expressive language on a standardized test.
That's obviously in Korean.
What's that?
That's obviously in Korean.
Yeah,
And
all in
it's
Korean.
a non-alphabetical language.
It's all in Korean. Yeah, yeah. It
So
doesn't.
it's super
I don't
robust.
think any of this really has to do with the print, because we're talking about 14-month-olds and learning vocabulary words that are being accessed. Right. Yeah. She did find, which is very cute, all the same gestures we find in the US, except one additional one was that South Korean babies were doing this gesture, this bowing gesture to express gratitude, even at 14 months. So again, just like sort of the socialization process, right? But that was more of a conventional gesture that wasn't, I mean, obviously it has one meaning, but they got it. Okay, and then April Boyne Choi was another former PhD student, has extended this work to children that are more likely, have a higher likelihood for having autism, doing work with Chuck Nelson and Helen Tager Fleshberg here in Boston. They had a sample of 12-month-olds who had older siblings who were diagnosed with being on the ASD spectrum. And again, same exact kind of study, parent-child interaction, looking at play. And I'm just showing you again the final results here, but basically when you control for a whole bunch of things like the caregiver education, the gender, all kinds of stuff, it's the children's gesture use at 12 months in this case that predicts their receptive vocabulary 1 year later. Okay, so the findings are pretty robust. I'm just showing you my findings. Other people have found the same thing. I will say though, if you look at children's pointing gestures before 12 months, you don't see the result. And here's where we're starting to see that they're showing and giving is what is the earlier predictor. So when you see null results, they tend to be too early, is what I think at this point, but we'll see. So all of this work led me to start thinking, well, maybe if we can boost children's gesture use early on, we could boost their vocabulary, right? Maybe that's a good place to start. We looked at, I plotted the Chicago data here sort of empirically to see what it looked like if you were to take our regression models from these longitudinal studies and look at, for example, the kids who started out at 14 months at high versus low gestures from high versus low socioeconomic backgrounds. And what you see is that this top line here at age 46 months is the estimated vocabulary for children who were gesturing a lot when they were 14 months and from the higher SES backgrounds. The bottom line is the kids who were not gesturing so much and from the lower SES backgrounds, but what you see is these lines in the middle kind of overlap. Whereas if you were from one of the lower income families in the study, but you were gesturing a lot at 14 months, and we had people that fell into this category, by 46 months, your estimated vocabulary growth based on all the longitudinal data we have in the study would be up in that middle area. Yeah.
Is there equivalent relation between like production of gesture compared with input of gesture? With the comparison I'm thinking is with amount of terms versus input, right? So is that the amount of gesture produced is more predictive?
Then the terms.
Like the other result we already showed of terms?
I think that's a really great question. You know, when we were doing all this data, I was so interested in gesture. I was not so interested in terms, although in my qualifying paper, Paul and I had to do this thing called a qualifying paper when we were PhD students, which was, you know, like you do a paper before you do your PhD dissertation.
Right.
I looked at what I called pointing sequences. So it was like just kind of like what you saw in that book reading, like the parent-child, back and forth. And I found that those sequences were more predictive than the amount that the child pointed, if that makes sense.
The sequence of
A sequence is like a turn, right?
Right.
A gesture back and forth is what I called it then. I actually haven't done that again, but, so if I had to guess, I think that if you were to say, well, how many of those points that the child produced were within a back and forth turn-taking scenario, that would be the stuff that mattered the most. Because sometimes children point and no one's paying attention. Right? And what I'm going to get into is I think one of the reasons pointing is so helpful is because often it elicits a verbal label for what the thing they're looking at, which is how kids learn words when they're 14 months old. Right. Okay. Any other questions? one question I often get at this point though is, well, how come the line's not all the way up at the top? Right? Like, the child from a lower income family who's gesturing a lot at 14 months, why does he only get halfway up and not all the way up? And I just think that speaks in some ways to the limitations, like, I mean, now I'm like, you know, telling you that this doesn't matter as much as I think it matters, but I think you know, you can only get so far, right, with the environment and the interaction, and I don't know why we can't get that line to go higher.
And why it doesn't catch up to the high.
Yeah, so why is this line here and not up here,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Well, you talked about stress, time.
Yes, exactly.
All of those structural.
Right, and when we look at these input measures in a lot of our studies, we explain what I consider to be a large amount of variation in vocabulary. But when I say large, I'm talking like 45%, right? There's still a huge chunk that is explained by a lot of other life, you know, factors. I think 45% is enough to like spend my life doing this time, right? Okay. Well, I mean, it's a proxy for the language environment. Well, I think the gesture use is, I mean, at this age is the measure, you know, when you look developmentally, that's sort of, yeah, that's right. It is just one thing. We could add parent talk in here as another, yeah, play a little bit. Good point. Okay, so why does gesture matter? I said a little bit that children learn to talk through their social interactions with others. We know that. This emergence and use of pointing might also be socially mediated, right? So the kids who see it more, whose parents use more pointing, that we have those correlations, might point more themselves. We also know from a fair amount of studies now, more so than this one, that parents tend to translate their children's gestures into words. And like you saw in that example, they tend to do that like right at those sort of ideal teaching moments when children are looking at the object and pointing to it, like they get the word for it, right? It's sort of an ideal word learning scenario. So these are some of the reasons, mechanisms, some of the mechanisms that gesture might be helpful. So what do? We took this body of work and decided to try to design a small intervention study. My goal was really, more than anything, to see if changing parents' use of gesture would change children's, right? We have these correlations, but they're not causal, right? So I had a very sort of researcher goal, like, is this a causal mechanism or not? But then the thought was, well, can you give parents information and actually maybe increase the amount that they're pointing with kids when they play? And so that was a secondary question at the time. So we designed the study, Pointing to Success. It was funded by the NICHD. And here's where the knowledge and mindset stuff comes back in, is like the theory of change for this intervention, small-scale intervention, was to focus first on parents' knowledge about early language development, help them understand what gesture looks like, that children gesture, that they're trying to communicate, and you can gesture with them, promote their gestures, respond to their gestures, all this stuff. And that what you do makes a difference. By gesturing with your child, you can boost their language development. So the intervention, which I'm pointing to in this part, was just a 5-minute video that we created with all of that messaging. Then our theory was that this would increase how much parents gesture, the child gesture, and ultimately, like, maybe the children's vocabulary growth, right? But, you know, that was hopeful. Sorry, my phone's ringing. Okay, so what did we do? I'll go through this quickly. We recruited 50 families. We told them it was a study about play and development. One of the video you saw before was from the study. We went and did home visits. These were families in the Boston area. We went to their homes. This was because we wanted the sample to be at least half lower educated parents, like parents who had not gone to college. And it's hard for us to get families from that demographic to come into the lab. So we decided we're gonna go home to their homes. We had them play for 15 minutes with different types of toys that we brought, and we videotaped them just like you saw. The parents filled out questionnaires about reporting on their children's vocabulary comprehension, CDI measures, about their own knowledge about child development, about their intelligence mindsets. Then we randomly assigned, in the moment, it was this family, we pulled a card in the intervention or control group, and if the family was in the intervention group, we showed them the 5-minute video on an iPad. If we want to give you some information about your child's communication at this age. And that was it for the intervention piece. We then gave all the families toys to play with and said, try to play with these toys once a day. With the intervention group, we said, and try to point while you're playing. And then we went back to the homes every 2 months up until 18 months and recorded more interactions and quoted them and transcribed them and all of that and got measures of children's vocabulary growth. So we also texted the families only in the intervention group every Friday. Are you playing? Are you pointing? Okay. So what did we find? Is there an effect of the intervention on parent-child pointing? We found, this is the raw data, completely raw data, that from visit 1 to visit 2, yes, this is parent gesture use. The parents who watched the 5-minute video, 2 months later when we went back, were gesturing more in those interactions with the kids than compared to the control group parents. And you see that they stay above, but it's not significant after the second visit.
And the
yeah.
control is business as usual? I
The
forgot.
control what?
The control condition was business as usual, so they didn't get anything? They
They got the toys and were told to play once a day,
Okay, okay.
but we just didn't say point. And we know play is good for language, so yes, I feel like,
Okay, so they were.
right, there was no business as usual control because
Okay.
the NIH reviewers didn't want.
Yes, no, now that you. Well, we wondered
I know.
You wonder what.
Yeah, so I feel like this effect is probably an underestimate because
Yeah.
everybody was playing with toys and they're probably pointing because we tried to give them toys that were in the illicit pointing,
Okay.
but we didn't see
No.
them point.
You wonder what would have happened if rather than just sending once a week a text, you had sent once a week a new video, a 3-minute video.
Well, right, exactly. So that's where we're going now in some of the work. Yeah, because obviously these kids are getting older too, and like by the time they're like 16 months, pointing isn't, I mean, the most important thing anymore anyway, right?
And remembering a 5-minute video from months ago.
Oh, you mean, yeah,
is
that's
pretty
right.
difficult.
Although parents would write back to the text, he pointed. We were getting feedback that way. We didn't expect them to respond to the text. Okay, we dug a little deeper into this because this was sort of depressing but kind of exciting. We figured, okay, let's look at this more. We need to control for what the parents are doing in time 1. So we dug deeper. I'm going to show you data now just from like visit 1 to visit 2, 10 to 12 months. And what we see here is that when you control for how much the parents are pointing in the baseline, right, in that regular video before you assign the groups, there is a significant increase in the parent pointing. And then this is what I really love, is that the kids increase too, right? So to me that suggests, okay, this correlation we have between parent pointing and child pointing is sort of causal. In the moment, in the interaction, if parents point more, children are going to point more as well. And I don't think that's super surprising, but it's nice to be able to show that. So then we thought, okay, well, we purposely selected the sample to be diverse in some background factors, so let's look at whether those factors moderate the effects. And we were underpowered to do most of this. This was a pilot study, so just keep that in mind. But we were interested in maternal education, the knowledge of child development, and parents' mindsets. And so what did we find? We found no moderating effect of parent education, which was interesting and kind of nice. So it didn't matter if the parent had been to college or not, the effect was the same. We also found no moderating effect of parent knowledge of child development. So parents, how much parents knew about child development is measured on the kitty I think I used in this study, did not make a difference for this. Then we found this interesting finding where the intervention had a stronger effect for the parents who endorsed fixed mindsets at baseline. So the parents who said on the direct, 6 or 8 items, I forget, whose score was more fixed, right? So their beliefs were more like, oh, intelligence is fixed. My child's just going to have a certain amount of intelligence. There's not that much I can do about it, or they can do about it, whatever. That's how they're going to be. Those were the parents that changed the most, which is super interesting. And it was counter to what I expected. It's the same thing here for the children, right? So those are just basically parallel graphs, like the parents and the children. But the way I've made sense of it and thought about it is like, okay, wow, so maybe they have these fixed mindsets, and then you give them information like, hey, look what your kid's doing, and you can make a big difference, and maybe they actually start doing it, and then they get the feedback that, oh yeah, now my kid's pointing, so that was true, right? We didn't change their mindset, so we measured their mindsets again at the end. And there was this like slight non-significant movement towards the growth side, but not significant. So the goal wasn't like change their view of the world, right? It was more like just give them information about this one thing that they can do, and they seem to take it up. So that's, but again, completely underpowered analysis here. And then we looked at the effect on vocabulary. Here we measured, okay, it's too much on that graph. We have the CDI, which is longitudinal, so that's parent report. The parent tells you on the checklist over time, like how many words their kids know. But then we also at 18 months did the Mullen expressive vocabulary scales. And in both cases, there was no main effect of the intervention on vocabulary. But we had this weird interaction with the mindset piece where, you know, for the kids whose parents had fixed mindsets at baseline, there was significant growth in the, if they were in the treatment group. These are small numbers. There was significant growth in the, on the CDI and on the Mullen. Okay, so suggestive, I mean, don't make too much of it. But interesting, so what did we find? We found that the pointing to success intervention resulted in short-term effects on parent gesture and child gesture, and I think the strongest finding here to take away is that it did provide evidence for the sort of social mediation hypothesis that like parents gesture more, children are going to sort of come along and gesture more themselves. It was most effective for the fixed mindsets regardless of SES. And it just, I think this is one example of like we need to think about who these interventions might work for and why. Yeah.
But this is wonderful result, I think, because it's a compensatory effect.
It's a what effect?
It's like a compensatory effect.
Yeah.
Right? Because you are changing more the people that you need change more. The fixed.
But the fixed and the growth actually didn't differ significantly at baseline. So.
But the kids at least.
Yes, yes. I mean, I just think it's interesting because it's malleable. There's something here, like we had a 5-minute video. I did look back and there were 8 times in the video that we said things like, you can make a big difference in your child's language development by just pointing with them, right? So we were targeting the mindset purposefully. But it was like a little nudge. I mean, it wasn't, you know, major behavior modification or anything. So I think it's interesting. And now we have replicated this whole study. A former PhD student of mine, Virginia Sallow at the University of Maryland, did the study in Nathan Fox's lab with the kids with EEG, and that's in press right now in developmental psychology, but basically same findings. Increased parent gesture, increased child gesture. And we did find a main effect on vocabulary in that study, but it was only at the 1 month, it was only 1 month later, and it was only parent report. But there's some interesting EEG findings in that study too, showing that the kids who saw more increased gesture had more activation when they saw other people gesture in the lab environment. So there's something about seeing the gestures that is helping children learn how to communicate themselves.
What I don't understand is what's your hypothesis as to why it didn't translate into higher vocabulary later on?
Well, it's one little thing kind of to Paola's point earlier when I showed those lines, like, okay, so we're targeting, you know, pointing gestures during these play interactions, a few minutes a day. You would hope that a parent that would transfer to other types of situations, maybe not. We didn't say anything about what the parents are talking about, or, you know, I mean, it's
insufficient.
Yeah, I mean,
That's the
I
right
think
direction.
what, you know, I think to really get it to relate to vocabulary later on, after the gesture interventions, parents need like a vocabulary video, then they need an asking question video, then they, you know what I mean, like
Equivalent to your slide.
like my slide, yeah, you need to, and that's what we've been working on now, is like, why not just tailor the information to the age of the child and keep going with it? And also, you know, I mean, the parents did drop a little, so it could be like, they gesture a bit, they're playing, they're doing it, the kids start doing it, and then, great, I take a point now, and they're pointing, and this is what we do, and, you know, I don't know, I mean, I don't have, enough qualitative data to figure it out, but.
Can I just put one
Yeah,
comment to the group? To me, one of the things that's really impressive about this is that I think for some researchers, seeing seeing focus on parental studies, if you have a choice between focusing on parental interventions or focusing on classroom interventions, you focus on the classroom interventions because they're higher impact and you have low resources. But if you look at, I mean, if this kind of thing, taking it out further, has vocab results, this can go to scale so easily. It's
Well, I mean,
videos.
those are one of the challenges later. I mean, yeah, so our
Right.
5-minute video could go to scale, right, yeah.
But even if you have more videos, so this is, I mean, when you first said that they're micro interventions, those are usually so costly. But if
Right.
this, if they continue working in this direction, parental interventions become not such a trade-off with classroom interventions. That's what's, to the economists in the group, that's what's really exciting.
Yeah, well, I would absolutely argue for both, especially if you live in a society where the high quality, early education is not available to everybody.
Right.
Yeah.
Just wondering, I want to come back to something that Raoul said that, ultimately, could gesture be seen as almost a proxy, for the language environment? So I feel like, couldn't gesture be seen as a proxy for language environment? And so then what you, right, so you're kind of teaching to the task, so you're kind of helping the parents with one specific thing that they can work on with the kids, but ultimately it's what you're saying, and you really do need to give them enough information about the entire language environment, ultimately to have an
Yeah.
impact kind of on, something as far as
Okay.
vocabulary.
I think that's right, but I guess what I'm trying to say with these dimensions is the way I've approached this is to enter in on the green dimension, which is about, sorry. Are you seeing that? No, okay. To enter in at the green dimension of like the context and the content, because I feel like that is easier to understand. And then I feel like the other stuff comes along with it. Like if you're pointing more, you're labeling more, and you are. Like most of parents' points are don't occur in isolation without speech, right? And if you tell people to talk about the past, they start using complex sentences. So do you see what I'm saying? I agree that like the more parents understand all of this, the better. But if you're trying to find little entry points, that's the approach I've taken. Yeah.
And more meaningful also, because you don't want the parents to, say complex sentences for the sake of complex
Right.
sentences. You want them to engage
That's
in
right.
a conversation.
Right, and it doesn't mean anything to say, like, I'm not kidding, like, people have tried, like, speech language pathologists have tried this stuff, like, use more relative clauses.
It's not daunting.
All right, my computer is now, I don't know what's happening, but hopefully it'll be okay. All right.
Sorry, sometimes it
Oh, it's not my computer.
It's not
Well, let me just, it just wants my Apple ID for some reason. Okay, let me see if I can do this. Okay, is it working? Yeah, all right. Okay, good. So, all right, let me give you the decontextualized example. We just run through the same exact kind of thing. Like, so we, here, I'll run through this part. How much time do we have, Paula? Like a half hour?
Yeah, you have, until 10:45.
Okay. No, that's fine, that's perfect. Okay, yeah.
Q&A.
So, all right, same exact idea. We've been doing all this work on decontextualized talk. So just for the background, so you know what decontextualized talk is, it's language that's removed from the here and now, like I was saying, talk about the past, talk about the future. When you look at home environments, you typically see it in certain it comes out in certain ways, like causal explanations about how things work in the world, narrative utterances about the past or the future, and even pretense with littler children, like pretending one thing is actually something else that's not really there, is sort of decontextualized. It's relatively rare, but increases over early childhood, and it's more frequent in certain contexts than others. So toy play is actually not the best context for eliciting decontextualized talk, because people tend to talk about what's right in front of them unless they're pretending. So meal times has been one context that's been studied quite a bit. Other times like driving in the car, bath time, you know, et cetera, putting your child to bed, those are sort of when these conversations tend to happen. We have done a lot of work just to show you during meal times what we would call decontextualize and what we would call contextualize. It's hard to read this, but so this is the same family, same meal, right? And over here, the child's saying, I want more rice than Lizzie. The mother's like, you want more rice? Is this white rice? Yes, it's cheesy rice. Is it white? Yes, it's white. It's white rice. You have white rice, right? She's like, it's actually called couscous. Okay, so that is contextualized. Conversation during the meal, right? So the child probably learned the word couscous, right? Like perfectly reasonable conversation to have while you're eating. But then in the same, you know, mealtime, you get this decontextualized chunk where the mom says, so, you know, tomorrow daddy says if you sleep and don't wake anyone up in the morning, he'll take you out to breakfast. So the child's like, oh. The only tricky part about that is mommy has to go for a really long run. Why do you have to? Because I'm going to do that race. Am I going to run? I'm going to run really far. Where are you having it? Where's the race? Yeah, it's in New Hampshire. Is it a race? It's a race that mommy does. Am I going to be there too, cheering you on? Yes. And so she starts talking about tomorrow. The child's right there with her. Then they're talking about New Hampshire next week with the marathon, and the child's having that displaced conversation, right? And what you see is like, look how much longer these utterances are, right? Look how much more diverse the vocabulary is, right? So it's just an example. But we see these kinds of conversations everywhere in all families. I quoted that Chicago sample, which was incredibly diverse, and every single family engaged in decontextualized talk. You know, it's just so it's a concept that's flexible. You can, you know, the conversations can be about anything, about yesterday or about tomorrow, whatever you're interested in. Yeah, it's just abstract, right? It doesn't matter what, you know, we're not saying, you know, label things like you have to teach these certain words. It's just talk about things you've done before, things you might do. And so just to run through findings, when you control for the amount of talk and SES, parents who use more of this type of talk have children with larger vocabulary growth from age 3 to 5. This type of talk we've shown empirically is more syntactically complex than contextualized talk, as you just saw in the example, and it predicts more than vocabulary. It predicts children's syntax skills and narrative skills as well. And here's where we get into the important part. Parents who use more of this type of talk have children who use more of this type of talk, right? So now we're getting to that sort of transition piece, getting the children using this type of language. And then to Paola's work, where we look at how much children are communicating with decontextualized talk in preschool, predicts their academic language skills in middle school. So this Chicago data set, these kids are now in college. Okay, so we were able to do that analysis. But so it's powerful, right? And it's not surprising because it's complex linguistically, it's complex cognitively, and what we also see is that those decontextualized conversations, they go on longer, so you get more of that back and forth, back and forth. So again, those dimensions are overlapping. Okay, so here we decided we'll teach parents about this, and we'll test it out again and see if this relationship's causal, the parent-child relationship. And so this is work by Katie Leach, who was a former PhD student. And what she did was she developed a language training for parents, which she called Ready Talk. The theory of change here is again focusing on these mindsets. So increase parents' knowledge about decontextualized talk. We called it Ready Talk. Didn't think it would be helpful to call it decontextualized talk. And I'll tell you what the letters mean in a minute. But the focus again on helping parents understand what Ready Talk is and on how they can make a big difference in their child's language by using this kind of talk. We thought then that would increase parents' use of decontextualized talk and increase children's use. We didn't have a later outcome in this study on language outcomes in the kids. This was Katie's dissertation, so it was a relatively small study. So here's what we taught the parents. This is just a one-page overview, but it's a video again. It's a 14-minute video this time, because she goes through each letter. And for each letter, she has embedded videos of parents actually having conversations with their kids. So there's like a modeling component to it. So the R's we call past events. The E is explain unfamiliar words and concepts. The A is ask questions, particularly open-ended questions. The D is discuss the future. And the Y is you can make a difference in your child's future academic success. Is the way we pitched it this time. So we did this same kind of study as last time. It was 36 families, middle-class families in Cambridge who did come to the lab. So this is already, we're just testing this, really just testing that causal relationship between parents and kids. We called it the Family Mealtime Study. We had 4-year-olds, was the target age for the children. They came into our lab, they had a snack. We told them on the phone before they came in, when you get here, the first thing you're gonna do is have a snack. Which of these 3 snacks would your child like? Parents are very particular about the snacks that the children eat. And then, so we had them in the lab room, and we just videotaped them for 7 minutes. We left the room and just videotaped, like, whatever they did during that snack time. And that was our sort of baseline measure of decontextualized talk. Then we randomly assigned, like before, if they were in the training group, they watched the 15-minute video with Katie on an iPad. Again, focused on providing parents with knowledge and supporting growth mindset. I should say that when we do these videos, we often, right after the parent sees it, we say, so if you would explain that to a friend, what would you say? It's kind of like a comprehension check, just to make sure they're paying attention, but we are sitting there with them, so we know they're watching it, but anyway. And then we gave all the families, whether they were in the intervention group or the control group, a little audio recording device. And we said, please record your meal times once a week for the next month. And we collected the audios. We ended up with 174 recordings nested within 36 families. We took all the audio data and coded it for all these things that were ready talk, right?
So
Yeah.
how old were the children again here?
The children were 4.
4.
So we coded all the audio for basically the things that we told them about, past events, explanations, future events, and questions. And then we made a composite. Basically, the questions, you can see here that they overlap with the other categories, right? So, and then what did we do with the stuffed animals? Or why are you gonna have lunch with Candace? So anyway, we didn't double count the questions, I guess is what I'm saying, if they also fell into a different category. So we have a composite of decontextualized utterances. And so then we looked at what happened, is there an effect on the parent-child use of decontextualized talk, and we see, yes. From the baseline measures where families were using 10 to 20% of their utterances were decontextualized, we saw a really large jump for the training group, such that around meal 2, meal 3, it was about 50%.
Why is the baseline of the training group so much higher?
I don't know,
Okay.
but they increased
Yeah,
more.
but you can see that the gap becomes bigger and bigger.
It's hard to have those decontextualized conversations in our lab too, because there's a lot of stuff in the room to talk about, we noticed. Like even though we had a snack, we have like animal pictures on the walls, and so we kind of backfired. Like it would have been better if all of this was at home. You know what I mean?
It actually doesn't matter.
I mean, whatever, I'm just
You're
saying.
looking at the
Yeah.
sorry, you haven't, yeah.
Well, when we listen to them, we're like, oh geez, they're talking about the stuff on the walls, that's not what we're hoping. Okay, so then this is the kids, and you can just see that they go right along with the parents. So basically, there's the finding the little finding we're looking for is like if parents talk more about stuff that's not present, kids do too, right? It's not surprising, but it's useful and interesting. And then we went back and coded the data later, and we saw, I think this is really important because the length of the conversation increased. So we increased the decontextualized language, but we increased the back and forth, right? So again, it's like the overlapping of the dimensions, right? So you get more talk about the non-present, you get more syntactic complexity, and you get more conversational terms. And this was just, we just chose one, we did this at, I think it was mealtime 3.
Sorry, one more question on that. So this is the result after 14 months?
No, it's just 4 weeks.
4 weeks, okay.
Yeah, so I don't, it looks like it's starting to go down a little, but this is all we have.
Yeah, 4 weeks from one.
Yeah, and so, and they know they're turning on the recorder. Right, so there's a lot of things to think about as we've been just thinking about like this work.
Oh, correct.
All right, so we conclude that it's possible to increase parent use of decontextualized language even with a brief one-time training session. And that results in children using more decontextualized language and also more back and forth conversations. So we need to, in the future, figure this out, more diverse populations, longer outcomes, etc. Yeah.
So there's this great company here in the US that is called ProLEER. I don't know if you've seen it. Maybe you should partner up because what they do is that they give you like kits, like play kits for children
Oh, yeah.
from 0 months to like up to 4 years.
Yeah, what's it called?
ProLEER.
Yeah. So somebody was just telling me about this. And they come with little booklets, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm just guessing now, and I've been getting, I'm a parent, I have like a 2-year-old and like a 4-month-old, and I've been getting that like very regularly. So the only thing that I'm missing is like
The
your
video.
part. Yeah.
The what to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, that, you know,
And it'd be
Right.
super interesting because I'm sure that they're huge here in the US, but even to people like me in Colombia, to receive them.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think that's a good idea. Well, and I'm gonna get to that in like 2 slides. That's where we are now, is trying to figure this out. So, all right, so to conclude for this part, you know, I hope I've convinced you to a certain extent that families can have a large impact on their children's literacy development just through their everyday social interactions, right, in home language environment. We think that caregiver communication, you know, parents, preschool teachers, whomever, we should be looking at this and analyzing it along these 3 dimensions, and that interventions can be designed to impact all of the dimensions, if we think about that carefully. And also to include some important moderating factors here. I'm talking about beliefs and mindsets, but I'm sure there are others that we could come up with. And then just a little bit about the ongoing work and the challenges. So we've been developing and refining the curricula, we call it Everyday Moments, to follow the whole projection, right? So I started with the pointing in the decontextualized language, but we are creating more pieces now. And then, you know, we've been trying to think about implementing this work in different populations and with different modalities, and this is where it just gets really complicated and scaling and, you know, so we do have one study funded here by the Lehman Brazil Research Fund in, where we're implementing these are sessions that, like, not videos, but in-person sessions in community centers in Ceará, Brazil. We've thought about doing this through virtual classes on Zoom in the United States and have a proposal in to do that. We've thought a lot about, well, what do we just do with the videos? You know, should we put them on TikTok? Should we get some parent influencer? Should we partner with these other people? Or does it need to be in person? Because in both of our cases, we sat there with the parent with the video. You know, can we make use of libraries, virtual classrooms? And the other thing we're doing is we're partnering with a company in Illinois to teach this stuff in high school, so that it's sort of a preventative approach before people become parents, to give them some of this knowledge. So we've infused some of our stuff into her other curriculum that is being implemented in a lot of public schools in Illinois. So that was sort of one idea. So this is the challenge now. I mean, and it's strange for me because I came at this work as like, I'm really interested in the communication and the causality questions, and now I feel like I need to do something with this, and I don't know, you know, the best way to get it out there, or you know, how to partner with this. I mean, I should call these, what is it, love? Whatever they-
I'm sure there are a bunch of companies
There are,
like that.
that's the thing,
Or,
right?
or partner with someone at our business school, to
Yeah.
present to a group of entrepreneurs up there, or the
Right.
entrepreneurial club.
I know,
college.
but
And ask who wants to run the pilot for you. Sorry.
so that's where, I mean, so that's where we are. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we have the questions, so, yeah, open for questions. Thank you so much.
Questions, comments, ideas, feedback, I'm open to any sort of.
So with the, I was wondering, how different would it be, this kind of intervention from most, studied, intervention with picture books? Like this studies, this intervention that give parents picture books to take home and read, how different do you think it would be?
Like the findings, yeah, I think, the ideal thing would be to combine them, because as I keep saying, books are amazing, and if I had the funding to give parents books and information, I would do that, because I think the books make all this stuff easier. Well, except maybe for the decontextualized talk, although, one component of decontextualized talk is connecting the book back to the child's life. So if you can, insert some information about that, or still encourage, different types
Do you
of.
think it would be like useful to do the book program with information, videotaped information? Because most of the time these programs do give information, but through different media, like either conference or instructions.
Yeah.
Instructions.
Yep.
What do you think the video is about in itself?
I think I've gotten to the point where I think that different people want information in different ways.
Okay.
And I don't think there's any one answer or one best way. Personally, I would rather read it. I'm sure there's another parent that would rather watch it. I think it's just.
And
Right.
keeping in touch with them, do you think it makes a difference, like the texting part?
Oh, yeah, the texting is, right, so there are so many dimensions that, some people even ask them, some people want to text, others want an email. Some people want, something they can print out, other people don't. So I don't think, I think you can think about these things forever, and whatever you end up landing on is not gonna work for everybody. But I think, the idea of books and information, however you give the information, yes, I think that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I love the idea of combining and having the books and the importance of books, but I'm thinking of parents who are not literate, who we have parents here in the US who just can't read. And this is a way to intervene that's very natural. Talking about the past, talking about the future, it seems like much easier and less threatening than you have to read, which makes a lot of people very anxious.
And I think that's also why we focused on toys, because some people like the idea, play is found to be helpful anyway for children's development. It gives parents that time with their kids. But sure, some families don't prioritize play, so, it depends on the population you're working with and what would be more. Pamela,
Well, I wanted to sort of respond to that because I've worked with immigrants about wordless picture books. So that you can continually tell a different story. I mean, it's somewhat contextualized, but you can almost more easily decontextualize it because you're making up the story. You've got the characters, you've got the setting, but then you can make up the story. So I wanted to kind of suggest that. But earlier in your talk, Meredith, you were talking about turn taking, and that seems to be very culturally grounded. Like in some cultures, storytelling and turn taking is not the way it is in Western society. It is more iterative, and people take left turns and then come back to the main idea. And so I'm wondering how that might fit in the cultural basis of your research might, need to be molded, or you think that it's relevant or possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I guess I've been thinking about turn taking as flexible enough if you're not thinking about a particular context. Because I don't think it matters, to be perfectly honest, what the context is. It doesn't need to be book reading, it doesn't need to be toy play. It can be anything, anywhere, just the back and forth communication, whether it's verbal or nonverbal. So, I mean, I know there are some cultural communities that don't value that early in life, but I think for the most part, we do see back and forths even with infants and parents, whether you're just making eye contact when you're changing the baby's diaper, or, you know what I mean? Okay, fair. But I think that's also another place where there's space for providing information if parents want it, if it fits with their cultural viewpoints, that little babies who can't really communicate or talk yet are able to engage communicatively without talking, right? Yeah.
So I think it's so beautiful because you are right. You have a lot of things we can do, but there is some main things that we can provide. This information can make a huge difference, right? So I was just thinking that you surely know the work of ProLEER.
Yes.
About interaction. So he arrived to a very simple representation of this main thing. I think you can do the same. He talks about interaction. You can talk about the importance of turns. So just an idea, because I think it's so subtle what he arrived to. And it works for any culture, for any, it's just the representation of an idea.
That's right.
And I think it's as powerful as it is interaction.
Yeah, thank you. So Julie and I spend hours and hours together, but we never talk about our work. Busy working.
I think it can be very nice.
Yeah. I see another hand. Hi.
So in the work that Beatrice and I do in Brazil, working with families in rural communities, we had a lot of interaction with young children's families through WhatsApp, and we had a mix of these book intervention with guidelines and things like that. And one thing that we realized throughout the 2 years that we were working with them was that there was an underlying belief about whether children were worthwhile people to talk to.
Exactly.
And I guess I'm wondering, when it comes to the growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, if the parents who have a fixed mindset are more ready to believe that my child is really smart, so it's worth, he or she is worth talking to. I think something that we were giving all of this information about how important it was to talk, but then parents didn't necessarily know how to interpret, or they didn't think there was something to be interpreted from the battling or the pointing, or the less articulate talk that children were able to produce. So I guess I'm wondering if you've looked at these other types of beliefs about children and about them as worthwhile exchange and communication.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess we've seen a parallel to that with slightly older children, where, like, I also do a lot of work looking at how parents talk to their kids about number and issue about quantity in relation to math development. And it's really interesting because parents are much more likely to say that that their kids are going to learn that stuff at school. Right, so it's almost like it's not their responsibility, or, you know what I mean, like, oh, they'll learn that when they get to school, or I don't, it's not my role to teach math. But parents do talk a lot about numbers, and they count things, and who has more and who has less, and all that type of stuff. And when we point that out to them, they're like, oh yeah, it's everywhere, numbers, So I do I don't know how much the mindset, we have measured parents' mindsets about their preschool children's abilities in reading and math. And they think their abilities in math are more fixed. So I think what you're saying, I think there's probably something there, like when do parents believe that they're, like at what age or what stage in the early babbling and gesturing and all kinds of stuff do parents like believe that their child's capable of, you know, understanding what they're saying or being communicated with? And I think that's an important question to figure out, right? Because you can give them a lot of information, but if they don't think.
Right, when they do it, they are sort of, I guess what we notice is that sometimes they would reproduce, they would do the start, they would ask the initial question, but then because they're not really looking at them as subjects who are communicating, then they stop at that, not because they don't know how to, but because it's like, okay, so they just did that, what do I do with that? They're a little person that's thinking and trying to communicate something, but if they don't believe that, it's not worth following up.
That's right. I mean, I guess I would show them all the data, like Patricia Kuhl's data on all the, like, you know, children are learning from everything you say all the time.
Yes.
All that chronological information, it's social, the social interaction is so important. Yeah.
But it's interesting that you're changing their behaviors without changing the growth of mindset
Right.
in that study, but something is changing there.
Yeah.
So what are exactly the beliefs that are changing in that piece where that information is interesting?
Right.
Something is changing, but not really the full growth mindset.
Well, I mean, I guess I would argue I just changed their knowledge about gesture rather than changing their overarching beliefs, yeah.
And sometimes you first change behavior, and that's what changes beliefs. We think beliefs first, then behavior, but sometimes we change behavior, and that's when you say, okay, my beliefs are changing. So maybe you had waited for a follow-up post-test, you might have seen changes in beliefs too.
This is what Dick Elmore used to say at the ed school, that he spent his entire career, this was a professor at the ed school working on teacher training, and he said he spent his entire career thinking he had to change teachers' beliefs to change teachers' behaviors, and at the end of his career, he understood he had to change teachers' behaviors to change teachers' beliefs, so exactly.
Yeah.
Also, I am wondering about the here and now and how it can change the reconceptualization when the type of activity with children are, for example, in the vegetable garden. Because I am thinking, for example, if you have some activity in the family, in the vegetable garden, and all is there in the here and now, but also you can improve the different conversation about describing, explaining. I am thinking about how it can change also the type of activity, because we have more result about this difference between contextualized language and decontextualized language, but also now we are rethinking about the here and now. I don't know.
So are you asking about the context?
Yeah.
How
the type of activity?
The types of activities.
Yeah.
Well, we do a lot of questionnaires about the types of activities parents engage in, but I guess it's not my goal to change the types of activities.
But I think also in relation to what Ale is asking, actually Lotte Heinrichs has a very interesting study with science in preschool classrooms, where it's actually this sort of decontextualized, but here and now talk, right? So it's playing with science toys about complicated things.
Yeah, right, and even Meredith Row has a paper showing that if you want to find abstract talk in preschool classrooms, it is the small group center-based discussions where it happens the most. The things like the science center or the water table or whatever, you know, because it's easy to make predictions, and even though you're talking about the here and now, you can still predict what might happen next, right? So predictions are a big one for classroom. But you can also go to the dramatic play area and then have a whole pretend conversation about, you know, so, I mean, even all that decontextualized talk is still sort of grounded in the here and now, but it's just giving the child the opportunities to expand, because, you know, when they go on further in school, everything is decontextualized, like this whole conversation here, right? So that really practice. So you could, yeah, I think it's easier in the preschool setting to say these are the contexts where this kind of stuff is easier, just to show the teachers, like, it probably happens here anyway, so you might as well make use of that. I wouldn't want to be telling parents, like, you need to do this activity if it's not something they would normally do. So we try to make the messages more flexible. Do you know what I mean?
And like, were you thinking of parents in rural contexts with their children?
Yes, no, I am thinking the type of activity, for example, en la huerta, I don't know the word. But like in the grass. And also in the family, because in the community, for example, it's very important. But I was thinking, you could be talking about the vegetables in the here and now, but you could also be talking about what are we going to do with these vegetables? And then you take it to the future. So even if you're grounded there. Yeah. There's room for the future and the past. Also for the abstract of.
Okay, one more?
Maybe if someone else has one more, I'll ask a bunch. Someone? I just had a kind of an abstract question, but it's the kind of thing that you can, I'm sure you can answer because you're on the. Yeah, no, it's not, but it's the kind of thing that you're on the cutting edge and yeah, you can answer, which is, at the end of the day, what you and Paola have talked a lot about is you're trying to level the playing field for low economic families, so when their kids enter school, that they have similar vocabularies and write similar vocabularies to kids from middle class families, so they don't have as large a disadvantage when they enter school, right? Mm-hmm. So my question is, as you've taken us sort of through child development, 1 year to or 6 months all the way to 5 years, and you've shown us some very promising data that shows that you can make a difference at different points. What, at this point, it's sort of in your career and thinking about the bigger problem, how close do you think you could get to in a scaled intervention at different years to closing the language gap in kindergarten? I mean, that's why I say it's really abstract. You and notes of those all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like there are policy level things that would help, right? Because I mean, I think the reason I focus so much on parents in this country is because of the early childhood education system, like disadvantages the lower income families as well, right? If I lived somewhere where everybody had access to high quality childcare for free, I don't know that I would be.
Not this group.
No one, right, exactly.
Latin America.
Yeah, so we're all in the same boat, but I think, so if you're thinking about those contexts, this is where I think it helps to put energy, but again, I feel like there are so many challenges, so I don't know, I can't say I'm optimistic because I feel like even just figuring out, because parents are so different and figuring out how to reach everybody in a way with information that could be useful, I think is hard.
But just the state level, if you could take one, 100,000 population.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think.
Do you think how much do you think researchers could actually narrow the gap with scalable videos?
Well, there's all this, behavioral economic stuff now, right? Where, I don't think it's enough to just give parents money, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if those people that are just giving parents money would want to also give them information, I think that would be extremely helpful. And books, for example. Right there, I think that would make a huge difference, probably at a really large scale. You give parents money and books and videos or whatever they wanted, whatever format they wanted. So I think there's promise for that type of work. I think it's very expensive. Yeah.
I just think in this discussion and building what Nicole brought, we have to bring school and parents together, because I think sometimes we work, like somebody said, listen, let's invest in parents, right? Because it's so powerful. Yes, but you have to bring them together. What we did in Maranhão is that we brought the school was the mediator of the WhatsApps and the activities we provided for families. And I think this is something we have to, the articulation, we have to invest because it's much more powerful than just working in school or just working.
Yeah, I think that's right. But ideally that would start really young too.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you so much.